Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to the History of Internal Communications podcast. I'm delighted today to have Katie Macaulay with us from AB Comms. Katie has been a huge supporter of the project and actually helped us when we first did our History of Company Magazines project back in 2014-16. Really important support, particularly with ideas and help with the project. So Katie's a major figure, a leading voice in employee communications, more than 30 years experience in the field. She's an international keynote speaker, an author, a podcast host. She's the managing director of AB, which is which is the world's longest actually established internal communications agency, which recently celebrated its 60th anniversary. I mean, that is really incredible. You know, one of the first. I mean, that's one thing we've seen on the project is the emergence of agencies in internal comms, and AB was the first. I mean, that is that's history in itself. And very quickly, Katie's a guest lecturer at Cranfield University School of Management in the UK, major university there, where she helps business leaders develop their communication skills. And something we'll be talking about a lot is she's the author of an incredible book, which I recommend all of you to read, called From Cascade Conversation: Unlocking the Collective Wisdom of Your Workforce. Which for us is a really important book. We're going to start writing our book soon on the history of internal comms, and I was a bit worried about the 2000s. I thought, well, how can I write this? Because you're going to. But then I read Katie's one. I thought I'll just copy half of that actually. Because it's just so good. So welcome to the show, Katie. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Michael. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to dive in straight away, actually, and really with Cascade, because and just let me, for those who haven't read it, it is such an important book because it's about this fundamental change in internal communication. So, and I could not agree more. What we found is internal comms starts developing in the 1960s and 70s, and we've seen this in organisations like British Rail and the Post Office. They start developing Cascade. It's very quickly they start developing this new way using briefing groups of communicating down the organisation, and then using mass channels like magazines and film to amplify back up. And really that was the model of internal communications from its very beginnings up until the 2000s, and dare I say it, some organizations may still be using that method. And Katie's book really is about how communications now, you've seen this paradigm shift. It's completely changed, particularly with the use of social media, with digital. It's now gone from this very top-down control to a conversational stuff. And of course, we've seen this ourselves in consumption, in the way we read the news. It's no longer about the news. It's about conversations now. We have conversations about products, and really this is that shift there. So the first question I've got is, what's changed? Because you published this book in 2014. So what's changed in IC since you published in Cascade? Because there was a lot of prophesizing in that book as well. There was a lot of, well, we think this is going to happen, and this should be out. Has what's changed, and has any of those things happened?
It was prophesizing, and I describe it as a manifesto because I think of it as, this is what internal communications can and should be, not necessarily what it was then exactly. So the honest answer is, I don't think actually enough has changed, not necessarily where it really matters. So what was prompting me to write From Cascade to Conversation was the fact that I could see, obviously, advances in technology. We've had that's just exacerbated, decline in deference, decline in trust, and a rise in employees wanting to be more involved in participating in what their organization was doing, where it was going, understanding its purpose. So the whole idea was, we need to stop broadcasting at people. We need leaders to step off the podium. We need IC folk to put down the megaphone. And why don't we have really meaningful, productive dialogues inside organizations? So what's happened over the last 10 years is I think, yes, we've got loads more tools and we've got lots more channels. But what I see, I think, is too many organizations still broadcasting just on shinier platforms. So to a degree, yes, there's been change, but I wouldn't say there's been a whole scale move to what I would call nirvana. And I see some organizations there, but they're not all the way there, which is, I mean, I describe that sort of end of the maturity scale at the real end of the maturity scale, which is, I describe that as working out loud. So that is an organization where people really genuinely can feel that they contribute, they collaborate, where their ideas are heard, where there's genuine exchange of information and ideas. And that working out loud culture, I see it in some places, but it's very, very sporadic, sparse. So yeah, unfortunately, not enough has changed. No. The other thing I'd just say very quickly, Michael, is that when we think about the best conversationalists, and this was all about the power of conversation, what I discovered, I did a years-long research into how high-performing organizations communicate, right?
Yes,
and what I discovered was the best communicators, and we know this in our personal lives, the best communicators are the best listeners. The best communicators are the ones that ask smart questions and listen hard to the answers. They ask before they tell. And if you look at channels now inside organizations, they are still largely broadcasting messages out. There's very few dedicated to true listening.
Yeah. And that's one thing actually I wanted to ask you about in relation to that, because I mean, this is always, especially in internal comms, chicken and egg, is it technology that's driving communications, or is it these bigger shifts and the technology is just a channel for those rather than so it's interesting. Exactly. You mentioned the end, the end of deference, and I agree with that. I think it's no surprise that internal comms begins in the 60s, that AB was set up in the 60s, right?
Yes,
because that's the big change. That's the swinging 60s, the end of deference.
Yes.
Well, the emergence of the baby boomers who wouldn't be spoken down to. But as we can see, this change is still going on 60 years later. It hasn't. One question is, because obviously there are channels there. You in the book you talk about things like intranets and social and so forth. Have there been new channels, or are we still, or are these channels still emerging? Things like Yammer or Workspace, or have intranets got better, or has that caused that? Has that improved this so people have more of an opportunity to talk?
Well, so 2016, when Facebook decided that they were going to step into the internal comms space with Workplace, I got overly excited because I felt we had been held back by poor channels for a very long time. And we can go into why intranets were so awful, but if you want to, but intranets were, and we, other than email, we had very few ways to communicate. Many organizations were still relying on the paper-based magazine or newsletter. Yammer in its early days wasn't great. So, Facebook stepping into that space was a signal, was a sign. And now if you throw a stick, you hit an icy app. Yeah, right. So there are all these AI native what they're called employee experience platforms. And every guest on my show has one, or they're investigating the right one. So, and these are great, that they, on the surface, they look like they solve every problem because they look like they're democratic, they're fast, they have, they allow for video, animation, audio, podcast, you name it. It looks like on the surface, they solve all the problems. But this is the problem I have, is that, social, if you think about that, is a behavior first, then a tool. So when you get social channels inside an organization, they don't automatically mean that dialogue flourishes across the organization.
No.
If people are getting into lifts and they can't look each other in the eye. So, it doesn't solve every problem. It's a start, but it doesn't solve every problem. I think that's the problem with these bright, shiny channels.
Yeah, and that's interesting, and I mean that, because when I think about it, since 2014, if we think of the way smartphones, mobile apps, but yes, and I want to go back to a phrase used there, and which I think is fundamental, is behavioural, and really behavioural comms. It's a phrase also which Howard Craze has used. He speaks about this new emergence of this evolution in internal comms of the emergence of behavioural communications. And I suppose a key thing really going on what you said there is, unless you have behavioural changes, cultural changes in organisations, none of this communication is going to take place. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you walk into a very complex organization, we work with international organizations. They may have a very diverse workforce, right? And generally, internal comms will be patchy. And you look for those kind of guiding lights within those organizations, that branch or division or part of the business where it's working really, really well. And when you see it working really well, it's largely because, as you say, leaders get it. They understand the power of communication. They sponsor and champion it, and they encourage that open dialogue to take place. Then those channels flourish. The opposite can be true, though, because I just want to say this, the opposite can be true. I've gone into organizations where they haven't got great technology, and maybe there is this one email that doesn't even go out through an email platform. It's an old-fashioned Outlook email, so no, we can't even track the stats on it, right? But it's open, it's honest, it comes out at the same time every week. It does what it says on the tin. Everyone is clear why that email comes out, and people know they can trust what is written in that email. And so that becomes a really important source of truth within the inside the organization. So again, can buck the trend. If you haven't got great technology, you shouldn't be held back by this, but you can still do it. Think culture, behavior first.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if the culture's there, and it's interesting, I think, what you said earlier about, because it's certainly there in the book From Cascade, is I think you're looking at these kind of leading organizations. I mean, it reminded me when I've read it of classic work, In Search of Excellence.
I love In Search of Excellence.
Such good book.
And Good to Great. Yeah.
Really, and it's the same idea. So Peters and Waterman, they were saying, right, let's look at the best organisations and what could. But what do those best organisations have in common? I mean, it's interesting. I noticed that too, and I know there are organisations that AB works with. Is in the case of Britain is. The Post Office and British Telecoms, and also Barclays. We really have gone into the archives of both the Post Office and archives, not Barclays, but we've looked at HSBC.
Yeah.
What do those organisations all share in common that make them just so good? Because it's interesting. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you with the Post Office and BT. They've been at the cutting edge of internal comms really since it began in the 60s and even earlier. They had Company Magazine. They've been doing it for over 100 years. I mean, what is it about these organisations that make them so good at comms?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because the thing about sort of Good to Great and all of these books is that as soon as they're held up as the pinnacle of best practice, they fall off that perch pretty quickly, and we've seen that with the Post Office.
Obviously,
So I always get nervous when I point to an organisation because I think, they're by the grace of God, because at any moment something could happen. When I looked at these really high performing organisations for the book, there were a few things that really stuck out. They knew who they were, right? So they had a real sense of why they existed in the world. And whether they called that a mission, a vision, a purpose statement, it didn't really matter. But it was baked into the DNA. And when you joined, you knew what you were joining. And they were very explicit about their culture and their values. We talk a lot about how they can't be posters on a wall. And they're not. The reason is because a value of integrity means nothing unless you tell me how it's going to inform my behaviour. Or you want me to do this and not that. So they're very clear of who they are. The other thing I'd say is that their commercial goals, they recognise they can't reach without great comms. And I think that's a real thing. Not every organisation makes that connection. So not every organisation is looking at their business strategy and they're overlaying on the top of that communication strategy. But that is the answer. So when you see an organisation that says, we need to improve our margins, or we need a better product portfolio, or we need to find cost efficiencies, the way we're going to do that is to open up a dialogue, a true dialogue with our employees. If we want to reach new markets, hey, we're going to create brand ambassadors of all our people.
Yeah.
So every time they open their mouths about this organization, they're going to have really informed, intelligent conversations.
Yeah.
So I think it's the way that communications is baked into the business strategy, how these organizations know who they are, how they're constantly listening and they're looking for those signals and signs. They're testing ideas and they're faster. They're also faster. The thing about internal comms that I've never really totally understood is that you can get an above the line campaign out there really quickly and it can fail spectacularly. And you go, oh, that's a shame. Let's try something else. With internal comms, you've got to get every I and every T crossed. And by the time it goes out, it's too late.
Yeah.
So, we are seeing best practice also, being honest, is a little bit faster than we used to be, and perfection's not held up as the thing anymore. It's about being in the moment.
And that actually brings me on to the next question, because I think that was a really nice, there's lots of takeaways from the book, but I think one of the big things is, and again, it's in the title, From Cascade to Conversation. You're talking about this new form and then the old form, and always, and I think one of the things about the old form was it was about presentation. You say it's about the journalistic background of IC, that it was all about crafting these beautifully crafted, company magazines or videos, and of course in the new type of communications you just can't have that, because it's just so it's just so fast. Or you can have it, but it doesn't become the defining principle, perhaps. Is that right?
Well, I mean, first of all, what you want is an environment where you're co-creating that content with employees. Because as you said before about smartphones, everyone has a device in the palm of their hands where they can be a broadcaster themselves. And let's not forget, if you've got 5,000 employees or 50,000 employees, within that mix, you've probably got a podcaster, you've probably got a YouTuber, you've probably you've probably got someone running a little business on the side that communicates to staff, customers or whatever. So we have this very grown up, sophisticated workforce that needs to be involved in the creation of our content. I think that's the first thing. And I think also, and we can talk a little bit if you want to about AI, but I think we're moving into a space now, when I look at the most sophisticated internal comms teams, they are, I guess, I've heard this phrase a few times, sort of thought leaders, thought partners to their leaders. They're coaching, they're advising, they're giving that strategic counsel. So they're not doing a lot of the tactical stuff. I still think actually the tactics are very exciting, and I love a good tactic. I love a great campaign, but at the same time, I think we can't stay in that campaign space because that's not enough anymore.
No, it's you're right. I mean, it's what I've forgotten. Clausewitz. So Clausewitz was a Prussian strategist, and it's interesting when we should never forget, when we talk about strategy in work, and the mission of IT is become more strategy originally is from warfare. It's the
absolutely. It's military.
It's military, and a lot of business leaders. It's interesting actually that strategy actually doesn't go into business until the 1950s, and it's because of the Second World War. A lot of these business leaders have been influenced by the war they served. But Clausewitz, in his book on war, he talks about the fog of war. So what he talks about is, it's really interesting. He says, look, you can have the best plans ever, but you can say yes, but once that war starts, everything goes chaos. You go into the fog of war, and it's about knowing how to deal with that chaos. Actually defines what you want, rather than just the strategy itself, which I think that's what you're saying out there.
Yes, there's a lot of fog. There's a lot of fog inside organizations. My job is to sort of rock up inside an organization and work out what's working and what's not working. And there's a lot of fog, and that's to do with various things. Inside today's organizations, there's a lot of noise. That's because there's a lot of channels. People are overloaded with messaging. There's also a lot of change and transformation inside a lot of organizations at the moment, and that doesn't always feel joined up. So that creates that kind of sense of fog. So a lot of the work that we're doing is basically to sort of piece things together and knit things together and make everything make sense for
Yeah.
employees.
No,
So I
100%.
love that fog, because I think
Yeah.
there is a lot of
Yeah.
fog inside organizations at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and all that noise, and like you say, with all this media, and I think that word you used before about this idea of co-creation, that the idea now is it's no longer just the comms people, and this idea that comms people are no longer simply about producing, but it's much more about curating, that it's bringing all these. But one thing I wanted to ask you, you brought it up here, and I because going back to this original question of what's changed since 2014. And I think one of the key ideas of conversations is it makes internal comms more strategic, because a new role appears of advising top CEOs,
Yeah.
the C-suite, of this is how you communicate. I mean, just because you're a CEO or a CFO, that doesn't mean you're very good at, and the idea, this big cultural change of actually having to talk to your staff. In the past, that senior leaders would not talk to staff or at arm's length. So this idea that a major role of IC now is to advise and to coach, to mentor leadership. Has that got bigger since too? Because part of me still looks at that and thinks, well, a lot of that's just rhetoric. I mean, how much of this is real? I mean, I know it is real, but to the extent of that. So has that role of strategic counselor to strategic mind, has that become bigger since 2014? Are more comms people doing that role, or agencies like AB doing that role more?
I think that's one of the biggest change I've seen, is that they are doing that strategic counsel
Excellent.
role more,
Excellent.
and they are acting at that more strategic level. I think they've had to. They haven't really had a chance. I mean, don't forget, COVID pushed them very fast into those boardrooms and excos. They didn't, there was nowhere to hide in COVID, because it was we've got to talk to our people all the time, every moment of the day, and also listen. I mean, there was a lot of listening going on, which was great at the time. So it pushed us into the limelight. So yes, I think there is a lot more strategic. Not it again, I've had this phrase that I've used for years, which is organizations get the communicators they deserve, right? So if you're in an organization where you don't feel you can provide that strategic counsel, it's just because your leadership aren't ready to hear it. And that you mentioned in my bio going to Cranfield, twice a year, rock up in front of 40 or 50 people running businesses,
really,
and say, this is what communications can do for you, but not everyone's willing and able to hear that. You look at the average MBA syllabus, comms doesn't appear very often.
No. I was surprised, actually, when I read that in your bio. I'm very surprised.
So yes, it's about opening the eyes of leadership to what they can achieve with great communication, and that takes a little bit of time and patience to sit them down and kind of find out what's on their minds and what they want to achieve, and then make the link. To make the link back to comms. So whatever it is you want to do, whether it's about improving safety, improving standards, being more collaborative, being more innovative with your product range, it's going to come. Most problems are better. Most business problems are fixed, at least partially, through better communication. And the whole idea, I mean, the whole idea around Cascade Conversation was, I wondered, and I don't know if this is true, but I thought there'd be a time, and maybe with AI, we might be getting there. I thought there would be a time. We are going to talk about it. But I thought there'd be a time when, for most organizations, their product or service could be replicated at the touch of a button. And the only real competitive advantage they had would be in the minds of their people. And how many of them are actually stepping into the minds of their people to actually work out and extract their full knowledge and wisdom. So that was the whole idea. Whether we're there, that we might not be there yet, but that's where we need to get to, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I couldn't agree with you more. And that's where this I think, again, I think when you say, well, IC is becoming more strategic, I think those are the two areas where you're seeing that link. Where your counselling leaders saying, well, look, you do need to talk more, and we're going to, but also that idea. And actually, I think this is the fruition of human resource management, because this isn't a new idea. I mean, HR since the 20s and 30s has said, our biggest resource are our employees. But I
Yeah.
think it's really now that's becoming, and through communications, it's almost like communications is unlocking that potential, that
Yes.
dream.
Exactly right. I agree. Yeah,
You
for
know,
sure. Yeah.
let
Yeah.
let's talk about COVID. I'm really glad you brought that up. And yes, I think COVID was the big moment for IC to step
Yes.
up, wasn't it? Because like, oh God,
Yeah.
how are we going to communicate with our workers now? So certainly, COVID was a huge opportunity for IT to become strategic. It was interesting, for example, that the Institute of Internal Comms was one of the advisors to the government on communication. So
Yeah.
government was turning to communication specialists and asking, look, we need your
Yes.
help. Have those, and it's really interesting because I've actually looked at the records from then, and there's this great positive feeling, and I see it's the turning point. And after COVID, we're now at the table. Has that been a case, or because often after crises we try and go back to before the crises? So,
Yeah.
did COVID create that culture change? Do
It's,
you think?
it's, it's a really good question because I think too many people said to me after COVID, we're retracting and we're going back.
Yes,
I
that's
don't
what I
I
was
don't
thinking. Yeah.
think I don't think that's entirely true. So there's a line that I've always loved, and I don't know who to attribute it to, but the line goes something like this: people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, that's lovely.
And that was
Lovely.
COVID. We had to turn up as human beings and we had to be present, and it wasn't about perfection and it wasn't about sharing messages. It was about listening. It was about, guys were taking their ties off, leaders were stepping out from in front of behind the desks, and it was all about that humanity and that vulnerability and that connection. I don't think that's completely gone away, and I think that's a positive
Yes.
that's come
Yes.
out of such an awful
Yes.
tragedy.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
But and the other positive, of course, is technology. The fact that, we turned all those channels on to reach people
Yes.
immediately.
Yes.
I think, that was a positive as well. I just
Yeah.
want to say one thing, though, that I think gets forgotten in all of this. Many of our client organizations are logistic companies, they're manufacturing companies, they're transport companies. These are not people sat behind a desk. So all the
Yes.
way through
Yes.
COVID, they were still on the front line, but just
Yeah.
in more difficult circumstances. So again, it didn't change everything everywhere because there were
No.
still people
No.
turning up to
I,
work.
I think you're
Um,
right. We tend to think of COVID as hybrid work of homework, but obviously not. The fact that we still had
yeah,
all these services, there were still people.
exactly.
Uh, uh,
Exactly. So yes, it left a shadow, I think, not all of it bad. And I think it sort of probably reminded us that, yeah, control matters a little bit less than caring, and we've got to
okay.
show up as ourselves.
Okay. So COVID then obviously a huge tragedy, but and it's interesting. I think it was a positive, and it you'd written your book. Other people were talking about this. I mean, it's interesting that one source you mention a lot is the 2012 McKinsey report, the social economy. Where they were kind of
Yeah,
prophesizing these big
yeah.
changes. But really, would it be fair to say it took COVID to actualize a lot of these
Oh, totally, totally. We
prophecies?
were, yeah, yeah, there's so much complacency, isn't there, until you're prompted in a disaster or crisis to actually
Yeah,
act.
yeah.
And so, and again, it was great for, nailing finally the coffin on presenteeism. This is idea that if I can't see my people, they're not working. Well, we don't believe that anymore. We know that people
Mm,
can be
mm.
very productive working, from somewhere other than a head office, for
Yes, yes,
example.
yes, yes.
So I think it did improve things to that degree, but I think we were given the limelight, and then all of a sudden I think things have slightly retracted. So
Yes,
we
yes.
still have to work hard, I think,
Yeah,
to get
yeah,
our influence heard and
yeah.
felt, as I
But,
see folk.
no, I think you're right, and it's inevitable that's happened. But the fact it's there, and I think one thing has changed since COVID. I mean, I've seen it myself as a worker, as an employee, is a change in discourse, in language, and
Yeah.
about things like well-being, employee
Yes.
well-being, an employee voice and inclusion, and
Yes.
all inclusive, all of these things, and
Yes.
and and despite Trump, these things are here to stay,
Yeah.
I think. diversity,
They are.
inclusion, and what's driving all of those ideas, of course, is communication. You can't have these things without comms being at the forefront
Yeah.
of.
Yeah, comms unlocks it, but I think what's driving it is, I mean, I'm reading a lot, and I don't know if you are, Michael, that there is going to be a talent crunch. There is going to be
Yes,
a
yes,
scarcity of talent around
absolutely.
2030
Yes,
in
yes.
sort of, in first world countries at
The
least.
demographic
And
crunch. Yeah, yeah.
it's a demographic crunch, and I think that again, employers are going to start to think to themselves, how are we going to hang on to people here? What are we going to offer them? And so many of my clients at the moment are looking at their employee value propositions. We give you something, you give us something. What does that look like? So again, driven by, do the right thing, because it's right to do the right thing, but from a commercial standpoint, it makes sense too, because if you've got a massive talent crunch coming, you want to keep great people, you want to attract great people. You're only going to do that by allowing them to come and be themselves and bring their whole
Yeah,
selves to
yeah,
work.
yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, it's the idea, you actually have to sell yourself. I mean, we know this. I mean, this goes back to the '60s. This idea of the psychological contract. There's a deal
Yeah.
between you and your employees. But I agree. I think that has changed an awful lot. And of course, and again, it's something you mentioned in the book, and I think we've spoken about this already. Is if you particularly look at younger generation, these digital natives, the Generation Z, and their knowledge of communications and their use and
Yes.
not just their knowledge, but their ability to communicate, to do these incredible. And of course,
Yes.
they compare what they do, and then they look at an organization how it communicates, and
Yes.
this can
Exactly.
create huge problems, which of course you didn't have that with previous generations, I don't think, or not to the
No,
same
no.
extent.
I agree. I agree. I mean, I always get a little bit nervous about sort of stereotyping people by the generation they were born into, because I see some, older people who are incredibly brilliant on digital,
Oh, of course, of
and
course,
that
of
I think
course, of course,
there's
of course.
there's signs. I mean, I've got a 21-year-old, and I think there's signs that they're going back to books and they're going back to analog, and they're turning
Oh
their
God,
phones off to have
yeah.
decent conversations. So
Yeah.
but you're right. You're right. It's about, one size doesn't fit all in today's workforce. And you've really got to think about how am I, adapting my content and my channels, my message, my campaigns, so that I'm really thinking about diversity in all its forms. And that's not just age, that's also accessibility as
Yes,
well.
yes, yes.
Neurodivergent people,
Yes,
um,
yes, hundred
all of
percent.
that
Yeah,
is rising up the
yes,
agenda as well.
100%. I think that's so important. I don't know if you've been watching on the TV at the moment. There's a really good TV show called The Pit, and it's actually from
Oh,
the
yeah.
guy who did ER,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's really worth watching because I think a lot of the themes we've spoken about, they deal with those. So things like,
Oh, really?
neural divergency and inclusion and communication. It's really interesting. It's almost like ER for the 21st century, Pip.
Excellent. I
So
look forward
yeah,
to it.
and actually that brings us on to that actually thing, and then I'll talk about AI because it's actually for me I find really interesting, and I think unfortunately AI is drowned out a bit is social media and internal
Mm,
social media because I
mm.
think particularly if you look at the academic literature, but even I think amongst practitioners, there was this great excitement about internal social media. And then that suddenly just disappeared because everyone said, oh, forget that. That's yesterday's news. Now let's talk about AI. But social
Yeah.
media has just transformed. I mean, if I look at marketing, the way social media has just revolutionized the way we create
Yeah.
brands and we market and we deal with customers. Has that has social media reached its fruition in organizations and internal comms, or does it still have a long way to go?
It's got so far to go. And that's nothing to do with the tool. That is all around the behavior.
Yes,
Again, you can have
yes,
the bright, shiniest, lovely tool, and it's sat there doing very, very little until people use it in a really effective way, until they. I
yes,
mean, the thing about social media is you have to turn up in a certain way. So you have to turn up as yourself. You have to jump into the conversation that's happening at the moment. You can't treat it like, oh, it's 4 o'clock on a Wednesday, so I'll
yes,
post
yes,
something.
yeah, and then it
You've
stopped.
got
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and then it stops. With social media, you need to do a lot of listening first. You need to do some listening and lurking and find out what's actually going on. Where are the interesting conversations happening? So it's all, for me, a behavior first. And then I find out how to use the tool. So, yeah, I just think we are a long way from it, because I just don't think we have enough people, particularly leaders, who really understand it. And I still get weird situations where there's icy teams in terms of social. If they want to reach everyone, they use LinkedIn. And that's how crazy it can be, because leaders haven't yet made the connection that the way I am on LinkedIn to find my next job is actually how I should be behaving inside my organizations, right? So we've got quite some way to go on social, I'd say.
Yeah, and you know, when I go, I mean, particularly to practitioner conferences, it's interesting. I keep hearing this word all the time: governance, governance. We need more governance. But I mean, I understand that all organisations, all institutions, obviously, it would be chaos. But I find that almost like a contradiction. You know, the whole idea of
It
social
is.
media. How can you control conversations, right? So, I mean,
Yeah.
what should be the limit of that governance, really? Or
So, I mean, this is this is a very interesting conversation. So you get into conversations like, do we allow anonymous comments? Do we
yes,
turn the
yes,
comment
yeah.
function on? Do
Mm.
we allow for anyone to say anything? So this is where I've landed on this, right? If you don't have many people, or only just a select few on your channel, then you get a few voices really,
Yeah.
really dominating, and you're in a
Mm.
dodgy place. Well, I've seen inside organizations where pretty much everyone, as I say, working out loud, they're using them, is that not one voice will dominate. Or if someone says something that's not quite right, or is a little bit dodgy, a little bit off, other people pile in, and it governs itself.
Yes,
So if I'm
yes,
in if
yes,
I'm in a conversation
yes,
where
yes,
about
yes.
governance, for me that's a signal that something else isn't quite working,
Yeah,
because
I
they
agree.
should
I
really
agree.
police them. Of course, you've got to keep an eye on things, but to a large degree,
I
they should
agree.
level set if everyone
Yeah,
is there and
yeah,
participating equally.
yeah, yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. And again, I just think it goes back for me. What is the real strategic element here is again using your employees as resources. You know, using
Yeah.
your employees. I mean, if we look at a lot of great innovations in organisations, they came from employees saying, well, why don't we? And to be fair, organisations did get that. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, even going back to the 1920s, you see suggestion schemes being launched by
Yes.
companies, and companies actually paid employees who had good suggestions, so
Yeah. I think some still do.
yeah, so
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
idea of listening, it is actually quite old. It's just it takes time, but I think you're right. And uh, it, it, it it's about unlocking the potential of your employees in order to
Yes. Yes.
in order to drive. How that's done, though, I think is going to be very, very difficult. Um, let's now talk about AI, because this has kind of popped up. It's the first question is, and for me, it's a really interesting is it going to be a game changer? Is it a big deal? I mean, I think there's been a lot of talk about what AI will do but it hasn't happened yet. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so how much of this is real and how much of it is just puffery? How much of it is just
Yeah, I'm going to be very honest about AI, because I feel quite kind of conflicted about it, if I'm being really honest. So
mm,
it's clear where, and maybe being conflicted is a good place to be. So it's clear where we are today, which is not fully agentic AI. It is fantastic at analysis, synthesis,
yes,
admin,
yes,
yeah?
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's a great
yeah.
productivity tool. So I love it for all those reasons, and I think that is going to impact our work, and we need to think about that. Creatively, I would describe AI at the moment like a tribute band or a tribute act, right? So, you know how these work, these large language models. They're taking vast amounts of human
Yeah.
text, and they're predicting and they're
They're
acting on
trawling.
patterns.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They're trawling it, exactly.
No,
You are never, ever, 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 ever going to get anything totally original that way, I don't
no,
think. Or it's
no.
really, really hard to get anything really original out of it. So that's good, I think, because these human things that we have like empathy, originality, ingenuity, all of those things then rise up the value chain, because we're saying all of this stuff, the admin, the synthesis, the, that sort of project managing stuff, that can be done quicker, and that's brilliantly done by AI. We move up the value chain. So I think it might elevate our human, that's the kind of best case scenario. I think
I totally agree.
There's a great book I'm wading through. I'm going to say wading through. There is a good book that I'm reading at the moment called Co-Intelligence. It's called, I think it's Co-Intelligence, Living and Working with AI by Ethan Mollick. And there's a couple of things he says.
Yeah,
it's a good one.
It's a good one. Recommend a good book. So that's really for me actually. Yeah. So and the listeners.
It's good. It's good. He says, one thing he says very early on is never forget, this is the very worst AI we're ever going to be using. So I think that's kind of good to remember.
Really
it is the very worst AI we're ever going to be using. AI doesn't know it's hallucinating because it can't step out of its own process. So that's a limitation of it, where we kind of know when we're hallucinating. For whatever reason we might be hallucinating, we know it can't know that. So what he says is, look, use it as a collaborator, work out how to bake it into everyday work so that you just are better at what you do, basically. So I think it's, I'm not overly pessimistic, actually. No. I would be more worried about the junior level roles inside law firms, inside accountancy firms. That worries me. Junior level jobs that now can be done by AI. That's worrying.
I agree. There was actually really, really worth reading. An article came out yesterday in the Financial Times talking about AI. And he was talking about this new phenomenon in the States he's predicting. He calls it the wire belt. So, in the past, you had the rust belt. And, of course, those areas where it was the same in Britain, in the north of England, in the old industrial areas, where those communities just got wiped out, coal left, steel left, or you might still have, a steel mill, but there's a handful. I mean, I remember going to Cadbury's World, and you go in the factory, the production area, where 20, 30 years ago there would have been hundreds, thousands. Now there's no one. It's just all being done, and all people do are look after the machines that actually make them. So he talks about this new phenomenon of the wire belt, where you're going to see, and this is actually going to be in areas where tech areas where you're just going to see whole thousands of people's with their work's going to be wiped out in this new wire belt. But by AIs, the wire belt will be the new rust belt. But I kind of agree with what you said, and the interesting thing is, my PhD, I looked at clerical work, office work from 1880 to 1914, and guess what? There was loads of stuff in the archives about a fear of technology, and they were just, oh God, typewriters. They were terrified, because if you think about that, clerical workers were trained to write, and they used to have handwriting tests. So if you had a typewriter, it would de-skill a clerical worker. So, or adding machines, these mechanical calculators that they were inventing. Suddenly, because clerks could add up huge sums in their minds. Now, a machine can do this now, you see. So this idea that machines are going to take our jobs, that's not just in factories, Luddites. It's actually in offices as well. That's been going on easily for. But the interesting counter argument, because for every argument there's a counter argument, was no. What these machines are going to do is take away the mechanical work and make and allow you to be more creative. It will actually do the horrible work that you don't want to do, and then it will leave space for you. Now, do you think that is the case with AI? That it will enable us to be more creative?
I do. I really, really do. I mean, I've just done a massive project with an organization where I've had to interview over 40 executives around the world. And, the analysis of that has been so much faster once you've kind of stripped away, and understood it from that point of view. But nothing can the thing is, AI can't do the 35 years of what it's seen in the internal comms world and do that empathy bit and
Yes.
think to itself, I can tell by your body language you're not telling me the truth, or I
Mm.
can tell by your body language you're deeply unhappy, or you're telling me something that you don't really believe. I can
Mm.
tell by your body language that you're not bought in, or you know what I mean? It just can't do that. So yeah, empathy, understanding, creativity, originality, all of those things we need to be really, really, really good at, because AI will
Yeah.
do all the other stuff. Yeah,
It will do all
definitely.
the other stuff, and so that's the case also then for IC people, yeah, because I mean, I mean, I've seen stuff it can do now. It's phenomenal. I mean, it can just create content, and I
Yeah,
think what's amazing, one of the things I saw is it's learned how to segment. So you can write content and say, right, write that content for a group of Generation Zs, write it for engineering specialists, and it knows how to
it
change it. So
does. I there's this word I am hearing a lot called AI slop, and I think there is a little bit of AI slop, and we see it
yeah,
on LinkedIn
interesting.
quite a bit. And
Yeah,
we sometimes, it creeps into email messages, it creeps into Teams messages, and it's people that are being a little bit lazy, I guess, with how they're using it. So
yeah,
I
I
just,
I
yeah,
agree.
there is an interesting theory that we are going to end up going to art galleries, for example, or reading books, and it's going to say this was handmade by a human, and we're going to go, oh, handmade by human, oh,
Yeah,
wonderful,
yeah,
how
yeah.
special is that? So just think about that for a little bit as you use chat or whatever it is, Claude. The handmade by a human, I think, is going to become really, really important. What can you bring that elevates what you're doing above the AI slop level?
Yeah,
That's what I would
yeah,
say you need to think
yeah,
about.
yeah. No, I agree, and I think that goes back to what you actually mentioned earlier, about how young people are actually looking for more authentic ways of content and communication. I mean, one thing which I find incredible is particularly amongst young people now is vinyl. It's like, oh my God, it's vinyl,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
records.
yeah,
This is real communication.
yeah,
It's
exactly,
not, and
exactly.
we're definitely, because I mean, this goes back to the 60s and 70s again. I mean, and again, we talk about Generation Z, but the baby boomers of the 60s were terrifying to
Yeah.
employers. That they're a complete is, but one thing these all share in common is this search for authenticity, for something which is real.
Mm,
If you live in a
mm.
machine age, then, and I think you're right. I think people are, and at the end of the day, we instinctively know when something is AI generated. I think,
I think we do. I think we do. And we're going to get better and better at spotting it. So, yeah, yeah, we need to rise above it, I think.
will
Yeah.
will that lead to more conversations then? Do you think? Because obviously this conversational communication which you talk about this is communication generated by people, not by machines. So
Yeah. I mean,
will
one
that lead to
thing,
that or
it possibly will, because if workers move into a space where they need to think about collaborating around an idea, around something new, then we got to allow time and space, and people talk about psychological safety and all of that,
yes,
to
yes,
do
yes.
that thing. So they're
Uh,
moving away from the mechanical repetitive tasks that are best done by something that's process led, and pushed into something that's more value added, which is around thinking, feeling, and all of those knowledge things.
yes,
So I
yes.
think that's good. The only thing I would say that I see folk need to be aware of is, obviously, very, very obviously, with things like Copilot baked into Microsoft tools, Office tools, whatever it is, that we need, when we think about content, to think about how that's going to be accessed and surfaced by employees. So in future, we are going to get employees just going into a chatbot and saying, I need to find out about X, and it's going to pull up everything about X. We
Yes,
need to
yes.
write our content for AI search engines. So it's just a small thing, but it is going to impact
Interest.
our
Oh,
work a little
that's
bit.
interesting. That yeah. But
Yeah,
that would make sense, really. I mean, you think that's what
yeah,
IC people have done for decades. I mean,
yeah.
when,
Badly though.
but badly, yeah.
I
I
mean,
know they
badly,
yeah,
and
yeah.
hence why intranets. If I say intranets to most IC folk, then I get a big eye roll, because it's like, don't talk to me about my intranet. Um, so hopefully, yeah, we will overcome that problem with AI that we've had for years with intranets.
Well, that's interesting, because that's actually led on to the next question, which is intranets. I mean, you kind of, I think in your book you give intranets a bit of a roasting.
I'm not sure. It was funny. I had a client yesterday who said, I don't have an internet. And I was like, oh, congratulations. Congratulations. But the problem with intranets, and it's not the fault of the technology, right? It's again coming back to, why were they built in the first place? And we had this kind of weird scenario where some people wanted a document repository, some people wanted a knowledge sharing platform, some people wanted to house policies and procedures, other people wanted a news space, and other people wanted this kind of collaboration space where we discuss ideas. And we tried to build all of those things on one site, and it just fell over. We just didn't do it. So I think, when I hear this, I just like, let's go back to the beginning. What is it that you need inside this organization? Is it about knowledge sharing? Is it a document repository? What is it? Go back to the beginning, build something for that need, as opposed to these all singing or dancing things, which didn't do any singing or any dancing. It just frustrated people.
And I think you're right, and I did like it. Made me smile, actually, because there's a nice section in the book where you talk about how there was almost like these DIY intranets that organisations. So it's like, right, we'll build our own one, shall we? It's like, no,
we'll build our own.
You're
and
a
Janice
bank.
is the only person. Exactly, you're a bank, and Janice is the only person that knows how to use it. And then Janice leaves 5 years ago, and we haven't updated it since Janice left.
No,
yeah,
and like I say, you're a bank,
times.
so you've got 300 years experience of money, not with intranets. So have intranets got better then? I mean, have they?
They have, but they have, because I mean, no one in their right mind is DIYing it anymore. So I think from that point of view, and again, and we must thank people like Meta for moving into the IC space, and Microsoft obviously still dominates with 365, but there are many more tools available, and there are some great ones out there. I mean, there are some really great ones. All I'd say, and I ask IC practitioners a lot on the show, how do you go about finding a right supplier, the right platform, and all the rest of it? They will all say, start by understanding the business and employee need first. Once you've cracked that, what you need, there will be a solution out there. But don't look at the solutions first. Work out what you need first.
Yeah, and I imagine. I mean, I was actually thinking this the other day, actually. Especially obviously because we're looking at this from over 140 years. It must be so difficult for organisations now, because there are so many channels and tools of communications. If you think about that, 60 years ago, it was like, well, right, you've got a magazine, a telephone, that might be, CCTV or briefing, but whereas nowadays the choices that organisations have are overwhelming.
Yeah. They are. I mean, I remember the early days. I started in 1990 in internal comms, and I remember in this very large British bank, you knew the channels were color-coded memos. So if it was a blue memo, it was one thing. If it was an orange memo, it was something else. But that was the choice: is what color did the memo go out in? I would just say that one thing that has changed enormously is media. So we talk a lot about channels and platforms. But one of the things I think we are very excited about, certainly at AB, is different types of media. And so a message can arrive with so much more richness and warmth, because it's audio, it's animation, it's a film, or it's served up in 7 different ways, depending on how you like to consume media. And that's a really exciting development, I think. So I love the fact that IC folk have really embraced new media over the last 10 years. So I think that's really been fantastic.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think obviously that will change the profession by its very nature. And this digitalization, and not just that, like you say, all these different platforms. So really, this brings me on really right to the end now. Is one of the last questions is, what new roles do you see currently being developed in IC? Because obviously, if IC has changed, and that is the whole basis of your book, that we've seen this paradigm shift from an old form of top-down, one-way broadcasting to a much flatter, conversational style. And we've also spoken about all these different channels and tools. But that must mean that IC has new roles, then, that it has to do things
Massively. Massively. And I mean, let's start inside AB. I mean, it's a classic example. When AB started in 1964, we were manned by journalists from newspapers and typesetters from newspapers. That's how we started. Anthony Buckley, where we get our name, was printing the Financial Times on Fleet Street. That's how it started. So even the roles within AB have changed, because now obviously we have client services people and we have designers and, all the rest of it, creatives. So roles have changed fundamentally in the last, 15, 20 years, and they continue to change. I think, what we've seen in IC is the role of, say, the business partner. That's been around for a while now, but that's that link between internal comms and the business, and the bridge that kind of understands both. That's become, quite standard inside most organizations. You still get some specialists around content, I think, but what we're seeing is much more of that strategic advice and strategic counsel. The most innovative project I've got on the books at the moment, and it is just recorded a podcast about it, is someone who's got a tiny internal comms team. I mean, it's literally just 2 people inside a manufacturing organization. And he has surveyed the audience, his workforce, to find out who are he's calling them connectors inside the organization. So these are people who others go to because they're trusted sources of information. They're not necessarily senior. They can be all sorts of roles within the organization. And he's identified those people and kind of turbocharged their communication skills. And he's giving them special access to leaders. So this is a really interesting role that we see ourselves in, I think, which is, how do we help the whole organization improve its ability to communicate, if that makes sense. So how are we, training, coaching leaders at all levels, influencers and connectors at all levels? So his project is called the Communicating Organization. He wants to create the communicating organization. That's massively strategic, and I think we're going to see more roles like that, basically.
That's interesting. And could I just pick up on there, because I think I've never come across that idea then. So you're saying then that IC, and and whether it's agencies, whether it's in-house, out-house, whatever, that it's now not just the managers you're advising, but the influencers within the organization. Is that correct?
Yes. Exactly right. It's a super smart way of going, because
that's really clever,
it's really, really clever. You have these people inside your organization, whether you know who they are or not, they exist. They're the people, for whatever reason, that others go to in the peer group. And if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, we know that the peers are trusted. So it really, it nicely fits with that trend. And then you spot these people, you get to know these people, and then you train them, you upskill them, you give them special access to leaders, so that they have all the information they need to be even better influencers and connectors. The other thing these people do so well is that they pass information back down the line, so they can be a leader's eyes and ears on the ground as well. That's not working, or you tried this message isn't landing well, or you're talking about this but everyone actually is worried about this other thing over here. So if there's one thing that people say to me on the podcast over and over again, it's this idea that internal comms is owned and managed and produced, and solely the sort of, we are where it begins and ends in the IC team. And really smart IC practitioners are realizing, I'm here to upskill the organization. I'm here to make myself redundant at the end of the day. I mean, that's not ever going to happen. But ultimately, if you think like that, you're probably on the right track.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think that's a brilliant way to end the podcast, actually.
What have I said?
Man, you've made half IC people redundant, I think. If this.
Oh no! I've made your work more strategic and interesting. That's what I've done. I hope.
No, I think so. And I think really, I mean, obviously, that's what kind of marketing has been doing for years, hasn't it? So I think
exactly
going down. Absolutely fascinating. Katie, thank you so much. And I'd just like to say as well, congratulations on your podcast, because I didn't say. How many listeners have you got now? It's about 1 million or half a million or something.
Yeah, we've got we're almost at 500,000 downloads in 55 countries. We're on
cool.
6 years of doing the show. It was only meant to be 3 or 4 episodes, and it's just gone. So and that's because it's risen. There's more people interested, which is great.
Well, it just tells you how big. I actually just think, from 140 years ago, when these little magazines first appeared, you would have thought it would grow.
Exactly.
Katie, thanks so much. Thank you for being
on the show.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks.